Welcome to This Week in Heresy, episode 80, Learning from Where You're At, with our guest via Skype, Pat Mosley. Hey Pat, welcome to This Week in Heresy.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So for the benefit of our audience, can you introduce yourself and talk a bit about who you are and what you do?
Word. My name's Pat Mosley, and I am a total weirdo. I live in North Carolina, and you might know me from the Pathos Pagan channel, where I blog as Common Tansy. Other than that, I'm doing work with Mountain CUUPs, which is the Boone, North Carolina chapter of CUUPs. And we're just kind of getting off the ground again this year, but anybody who's nearby is welcome to attend, and we would love to have you there.
Fabulous. And you're also a Gardnerian?
Yes, as of recently.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, that was kind of a process over the last few years. I'd been a witch for a long time and a pagan for, gosh, 10 years, maybe more now. Good grief. And it finally just got to the point where I needed a little more structure and a little more like, I got to the point where I guess I was humble enough to be like, maybe I could work with a teacher and actually be taught some things rather than just trying to like reinvent the circle every time I cast one. So I ended up finding and working with somebody that I'd known for about 10 years too. And she's got a very small little coven, but we're great together and just really grateful to have found that group too. Very queer oriented, which some would say is kind of hard to find in Wicca, but that hasn't necessarily been my experience either. So, yeah.
Well, I guess for me, it's more of kind of like an East Coast, West Coast thing where it's like East Coast is very different from West Coast in how witchcraft is.
Yes, agreed. There's so many different little vectors like that, like age and just experience that, I don't know, we're all drawn to Wicca for different reasons. And then I feel like it kind of transforms with those reasons into something that's a little bit different for each different group that does it. So, yeah.
Well, absolutely. I mean, for me, I had a similar thing where, I wanted some more structure. I wanted to be structurally taught. I mean, like,
Yeah.
some people chalk it up to my Catholic upbringing.
Oh,
Okay,
okay.
yeah, sure. But, I'm very left brainy in that way.
Yeah.
Like, even my mom knew it when I was little, like, and I was this biochemist for a long time. So,
Oh, cool.
I need structure. I need lists. I need, like, you do this here and that here. Although I've loosened up a lot more, but then I moved to the West Coast, so there you go.
Yeah.
But I totally grok that, like, needing the structure.
Yeah, and it's definitely changed things. One thing I've noticed is with the books of shadows that I've kept. I've always kept a spiritual journal since I started doing this, like 2004-ish, I guess. Rarely have I completed a full book, like every single page covered. And since I have been initiated into a Gardnerian coven, I have completed 2 full books of 200 something pages. And that's just like, I mean, I'm not even finished copying what I have access to now. I haven't even completed going to all the rituals that I need to go to or whatever. So, I mean, there's just so much to receive. And I'm really glad I got to that point where I was open to receiving what other people have already learned in this tradition too. And that was something that was definitely missing beforehand. Yeah.
Well, it's been actually fascinating reading your blog and the interviews that you've been doing while you're, it's obvious that you're going through your process while you're doing all these interviews and things. And the one that I actually first read of yours was I think it was a collective interview with everybody about transgender stuff in Gardnerian.
Oh, that one was crazy.
And it was awesome because there are still groups out there in our minds because you're Gardnerian and I'm Alexandrian-ish.
Cool.
There's still people in those traditions that are kind of have their head up their butt about things.
Definitely.
to put it
everywhere.
to
Yeah.
put it nicely, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it was really nice to see your interview, especially coming from the Gardnerian perspective, because that doesn't get a lot of press, if that makes sense.
I no, I totally agree with that. We're somewhat creative there with the privacy, and I've noticed that's not a very universal experience with Gardnerians.
Hmm.
Our It's interesting. That's one thing that drew me to this coven was that well, I knew the teacher obviously, but then she's very open, and the other people that work with her are very open about what they practice and what they teach, and the only thing that's very private is who attends.
Right.
Whereas I've seen with other covens that it's kind of the opposite, where it's we're descended from this line and these specific people, but you have no idea what we teach or what we think about really anything until you get in.
Hmm.
Which is okay, but I mean that's their cup of tea, and that's fantastic for them. I really like the group I'm with though, and I'm very grateful that we've been having the conversations like the ones I've been posting on my blog and whatnot, because I realize there are people out there who have misconceptions too about what Wicca teaches with regards to LGBT people, and I don't know. It's just been a really cool process.
Yeah. I mean, even the elders of Gardnerian and Wicca and Alexandrian, they're all like, "Hey, we kind of got over that a while ago," you know.
Yeah, definitely.
Because like I remember interviewing Janet Farrar and Gavin Bone, and they were like, "Yeah, we kind of got over the whole like gay people and witchcraft thing many years ago, and it's all good now." It's like awesome.
Yeah. And I mean, I hear bits and pieces of that through the high priestess and high priest of our coven who have been in this since, depending on the accuracy of their stoner memories, the late 60s, early 70s is when they entered. So
Hmm.
yeah, that's been one thing I've really loved about doing the interviews is seeing kind of the progress through different decades on how people have changed with issues and how our idea of inclusivity or what the goal of queerness in Wicca should be has changed through different generations and over time.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been interesting to watch because you've got, like I said, you've got some people kind of still holding on to things that should
Yeah.
just be let go, and then a lot of people really opening up, and I think that's really amazing.
Yeah. And it's really cool too that we have so many trans people in our coven.
That
That's
is
one thing
cool. That's really
I
cool.
love about this. Yeah. Because well, and that's like I've been in queer covens before or whatever, but the more established covens that I've seen, and a lot of that stuff we were talking about East Coast, West Coast,
Yeah.
a lot of the stuff I see on the East Coast, there's not as much transness going on in it that I can
Right.
see at least from the outside.
Right.
Um, and I don't think that's necessarily like a bad thing or anything. Like not everybody needs like their token trans witch or whatever. Um,
Right.
but it's really cool to be in a space where you're sharing circle with like trans people across the gender spectrum and like across experience. And I mean, we have intersex members too, and it's just fantastic.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And you actually have a lot of interesting culture stuff too, because I remember
Yeah.
reading one of your blogs about um Appalachian. Am I saying
Hmm.
that right? Um,
Yeah.
about
Appalachian. Hmm.
a tradition coming in with some of the people that you've interviewed, and I thought that was really fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I would love to. Yeah. And that's part of that thing too, where when Wicca enters an area, the area kind of enters Wicca too,
Hmm.
and there's this new sort of tradition that emerges in that space. And
Right.
so, like one of the founding members of our coven, I guess you could say, he's been around up there for a long time. He's in his 90s. He was actually raised by a Cherokee spiritual woman and a Satanist.
Oh,
So
that's rad.
yeah. This is all in North Carolina too, so this is
Right.
really fantastic. Yeah. Um, but that has definitely had an influence on the direction of our coven. I mean, you see that language kind of pop up in our rituals and in the way we teach things. Granny magic is important to us, and I mean, we actually kind of have that line. It's not just something we've picked up or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
but it's something that's kind of continuing through Wicca. Um, Whereas, in other areas that's kind of died out and is being sort of reclaimed or rekindled or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But here we kind of have like an actual line of it, which is really cool because it's multiple lines kind of merging together in our coven, which is
Mm-hmm.
really neat. But yeah, so I mean, Appalachian culture is a big deal. We're trying to be very tied to the land we're in, and not just like land based in name only. We have a lot of members who are active in different environmental concerns and whatnot around us as well. And then I'm more of the cups type of person because that's
Mm-hmm.
more my speed. But yeah, we're
Right.
all definitely very involved in the Appalachian area.
That's, I mean, that's really cool. And can you, for the sake of some of our members of our audience, because I have a very mixed audience, can you
Cool.
talk about what Granny Magic is?
Yeah, sure. Oh, this is exciting. So Um, it's basically like you hear about European witches, um,
Mm-hmm.
and how it's like the older woman is like the center of her village or whatever. This is kind of the mythology we put around this. We'll just move that to America and
Right.
down into like the Appalachian Mountain area, Blue Ridge Mountains, and you have women who are a lot of them are using like Christian forms of magic.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have, I think the book's The Long Lost Friend, is a big influence for like American folk magic. And then you have other different currents that come in through the Cherokee and then through other tribes in the area. And it kind of weaves together into these granny women that popped up sort of in the 1800s. They may be older than that, may have gone later. It really depends on who you're hearing the story from.
Mm-hmm.
But they were like the community center, from what I've been told. But I would also encourage people to look at them as a healthcare provider for communities that have been traditionally impoverished and ignored by the state.
Right.
And so there is kind of this radical aspect to it as well. Um, my friend in the coven, whose mother was doing some of this, was also an abortionist. So
Mm-hmm.
this is something that kind of weaves into that granny magic. And most of the stuff that you hear, like if you type in granny magic online, you'll probably get some little cool incantations or herbal medicine type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But there's definitely a radical root in there too. And it's a role that, you could say it's a witchy role, and there are a lot of witches who reclaim that. But it's a role that connects the community and, um, definitely is related to providing healthcare, not necessarily spiritual
Right.
stuff, but
Right.
it's that too. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you think about it, like I mean, I've been in several different communities where the elders are really revered. Like, I used to do work at City Refuge, which is primarily African American church,
Oh,
and
cool.
there's kind of a strain of that, a similar type of granny magic, where it's
Yeah.
like, your grandmothers used to do this, and and
Yeah.
and and then like the pastor would do something, and I'm just like, oh wow, that's totally hardcore magic there.
Yeah.
Wow.
Our grannies were into some crazy stuff. I knew
Word,
that.
right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
and like I said, it's like not the only tradition where you see that kind of really old and deceptively simple magic.
Yes. And deceptively blending into just the culture.
Mm.
Like, it's not specifically like they were practicing Wicca or paganism or something. They're Christian women who are also doing spells and doing abortions or whatever
Hmm.
else is needed in their community. Yeah.
Right. And so, I usually bring that up when I talk about my own path because I'm Christian Wiccan.
Cool.
And people are like, well, how are those compatible? And I'm like,
Oh my gosh.
grandmothers, Santeria.
Yeah.
I mean, take your pick. I mean,
There are plenty of
plenty of things.
examples.
Voodoo.
Yeah. That's I love that. I love multi-faith stuff. Um,
Excellent.
I dabbled in Christianity, you could say.
Mhm.
Well, no, I prefer to say I had a retrograde cycle through Christianity in my adult life. Um, I ended up not converting though. It just was
Mhm.
not where I needed to be, but it helped put a lot of things in perspective, with how I perceive the divine and how I where I needed to go from there, I guess you could say. But I have a soft spot for the Christian pagans. They're fantastic.
Aw. Well,
Yeah.
thank you.
It's well, which is kind of funny too, because anybody who's read my blog knows that I write a lot about Satan too. So you wouldn't really think that I would be into the Christian witchcraft or whatever, but I feel like it's kind of the same thing where it's
Mm,
sort of overlapping faiths that are in the pagan community, that people kind of sometimes don't think exist there, but they do, and need to be acknowledged and have their space to talk too.
I totally agree, obviously. But,
Yeah.
it also seems like there are certain, and I've read this off and on, and, there was a couple months ago, there was another dust up about that I actually confronted somebody about, like, where they're like, I don't want anything to do with Christianity, and Christianity doesn't belong in paganism. And I'm like,
Really?
really? Raising my hand. But I'm also like, if you think about Wicca and its origins and where it came from through
Yes.
Gardner, it's like that ship's already sailed.
Yeah. And it's such a new idea, in Western occultism to kind of sanitize out the Christian influence or whatever.
Right.
At least my understanding is that 100 years ago, I mean, it was just another way of perceiving God or perceiving the divine. So that's interesting that I mean, I guess that's part of paganism forming its sense of identity. But I'm ready for that to be over.
Right. Well, I kind of describe it to people like, we're kind of going through our bratty teenager stage.
We are, yeah.
Like we're realizing our identity. We're finally coming somewhat mainstream, where people aren't kind of like too crazy about you being
Yeah.
pagan anymore. And now we're arguing theology, and I'm like, wow, we're turning into every other religion in the world. Excellent.
Yes. Yeah, there is a lot of that, and with the atheo-pagans too,
Hmm.
I've noticed, that's another big spot.
Right.
Um, it's so funny because well, before I decided to write for Pathos,
Hmm.
I didn't realize that all of these conflicts are there, and I think that's kind of my understanding of how other people are experiencing these conflicts as well, whereas they're primarily taking place online,
Right.
rather than like in person or whatever, which
Right.
is another interesting dimension to it.
Hmm.
Part of me wants to dismiss that as, like, okay, it's just people saying whatever online because they can do that. But the other part of me is like, okay, so do we need to like make sure that our physical spaces then are like safe enough for people to express this in person if they feel like they're having to wait until they get online to have these arguments? So that's one thing I've wanted to really emphasize with Mountain Cups is that we have devout polytheist members and we also have atheopagans and we have everything in between and
That's
um
awesome.
and it's working really well too, and especially in some place like Boone, North Carolina, where I mean we have separate little pagan groups or whatever. Everybody breaks out into their hearths and covens at the end of the day. But it's nice to be able to like come together and share a larger space together. And
Hmm.
I hope other communities can learn that too,
I hope
and
so.
experience that. Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of hit or miss in the Bay Area sometimes. It depends
Yeah.
on where you are. I mean, like East Bay has a lot of really good stuff. San Francisco is mostly kind of reclaiming ish. But
Yeah.
like, I mean, there's a lot of other stuff there too. But and it's in South Bay is kind of a mixed bag depending on where you are. So, you're right. It's like depending on area, but I hope, you know, I mean, that's kind of one of the reasons why I started this podcast is like I wanted to kind of start bringing religious people together, specifically pagans and Christians,
Yeah.
and mostly. But I'm trying to expand that worldview that people
Yeah.
have.
Fantastic. I approve.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So now we're going to talk politics.
All right, let's do it.
So you're in North Carolina.
Yes.
um, and so, you know, do you feel like you're kind of on several fronts fighting against your own state government?
Oh god, yes. Um, yes, and it's overwhelming, because this has been an ongoing process for a very long time, and they were so strategic about how they have taken power in our state.
Mhm.
Um, they have passed some voter ID laws that my understanding there was a study that said that estimated that that would disenfranchise 5,000 transgender North Carolinians. I
Right.
don't remember exactly where that study came from, off the top of my head, but I can probably find it. Um, so, I mean, that was part of it with their voter ID law, and then our districts are so gerrymandered
Oof,
that,
yeah.
they have basically solidified their power at the state level. And so, like, HB2, which everybody's talking about
Mhm.
now, that was passed during a special session, so
Mhm.
there was not one trans person of color able to comment on that bill that was affecting their lives. No public interaction really, and it was passed in a single day. And so, I mean, there was no, and I mean, it was deliberately to attack the Charlotte non-discrimination ordinance. That in itself was a huge process trying to get that passed too. Um, but yeah, it does feel like an uphill battle against all of this. We just have so many different fronts right there. Um, that are being attacked all together. It's basically anything civil rights related, and parts of HB2 also affect the increase of minimum wage.
Right.
And there's just so many different issues going on with that. But then we've also had several environmental crises down here,
Right.
with our water, and the coal ash, which is another Appalachian issue.
Mhm.
Um, but there have been increased levels. I forget exactly what chemicals. I think it's selenium and arsenic, perhaps. But people can look that up online.
Mhm.
Appalachian Voices will have information on it.
Right.
Um, but a lot of us are just kind of waiting for our government to do some sort of intervention with the environment, and instead we're focused on mythic trans woman predators and the just crazy agenda of this government gone wild.
Do you think there's a huge disconnect between the people that are actually in office and the actual general citizenry?
Oh, yes, definitely. Um, and that's yeah, that's something I'm glad you brought up because I want people to know that too about North Carolina. There is no public support for HB2. That's why they had to pass it in a special session and why they didn't let us comment on it because nobody here wants that. Um, it, Sometimes Southerners get kind of stereotyped as backwards or
Mhm.
whatever. We have our share of backwards folks. Everybody does,
Right.
but there are so many supportive people down here. It's just really amazing, actually, in that regard. And it's interesting too to watch the reaction to HB2 because there are so many people who are not part of the queer community, are not actively involved in other civil rights issues or whatever, that are coming out and saying this bill is ridiculous. And that's been very reassuring to see so much public support down here. So.
Do you think that's true across a lot of the South and the Southeast?
Maybe. I honestly I couldn't really speak for any other states. I just have not lived down there. I've lived in North Carolina for most of my life, so I feel
Mhm.
comfortable commenting on that. But I assume it's probably the same. And I think that we've kind of had a generational tipping point with regards to just civil rights and with this generation that's coming up where we're just ready for things to be fixed already. So we don't want to be moving backwards.
Right.
But there is that block of people, and often they are elected officials who are not sharing that mindset with us.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Is it kind of, you're kind of waiting for them to either age out or die? I mean,
In some situations, yeah, and sometimes they do die off, bless their meat, but, I mean, yeah, that's part of it, and that sounds heartless, but so is HB2, and so is the anti-marriage amendment they passed before that, and the voting rights thing and all of that. Very
Mhm,
heartless, so, yeah, it's interesting, and some of it is generational, some of it isn't generational, or I mean, there are obviously exceptions to
mhm.
everything, so yeah.
Are you seeing like a huge response from the religious community too?
Oh, yeah. A lot of Christians have been involved. A lot of Christians have been speaking out, which I think is fantastic. Um, there, I mean, like, I know my coven was speaking out in various ways, and I know there are other covens up here who are doing different activist stuff. Um, so, I mean, yeah, there seems to be a very diverse response from the religious community down here. Yeah, that is actually really cool, and that's one of those exception things too, because, it's very easy to say, "Well, okay, it's the Christians who are elected officials who are doing this," which is true, and that's worth noting,
Mm.
but there are also so many Christians who are responding to this and being like, "No, this is ridiculous, and this is not what the Bible is telling us to do, and this is wrong," and that's worth noting too. So, yeah.
I think that's awesome. I mean, looking at it from the remove, it's like, what the hell's going on there,
Yeah.
And but I've been seeing that undertone where it's really like, I don't think the general populace really wanted this, and I think there's a disconnect between the people and the government, and that's why I asked you about it, because it like, if you read between the lines from the media and the press written
Yes.
stuff, it's
Yes.
like, there's something not quite kosher there.
Exactly, and it's been going on for a while. We have the Moral Monday protests, which
Hmm.
the NAACP organizes, and they've actually got one coming up on Monday. Obviously, they're all on Mondays, but
Right.
this Monday is specifically about repealing HB2, and so they'll talk about a specific civil rights issue, and there's usually a big rally or march, and sometimes people get arrested and doing civil disobedience during those
Wow.
events as well, and that's been going on for, gosh, at least a year, if not more. So I mean, yeah, there is definitely an awakened civil rights community down here that is very diverse and very intersectional. Um, I hope people take that away when they see North Carolina in the news.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of hard. Like, if you're not there, it's kind of
Yeah,
hard to really see it anyway.
yeah,
I'm a news and political junkie, so I'm gonna be, I'm gonna be watching news all the time.
plugged in. Yeah.
Right. But for general people, it's like, I'm over here in California. What's this? You know.
What are they doing down there?
Right. Right.
Yep.
Hmm. I want to go back now. Now that we've got the politics out of the way,
Yeah.
I want to go back to your writing and ask
Cool.
you, like, why you started the interviews that you've been doing.
Oh, great question. So well, that's a good one. So there is kind of this misconception that I have encountered, especially in like queer pagan circles, communities, uh, especially online, but I've also seen it with people that I've worked with, where the assumption is that Wicca is like backwards and
Mm,
not caught up on LGBT issues, specifically with regards to gender. And people ask a lot about polarity. That
mhm.
keyword slipped out of somebody's book of shadows, and now everybody's freaking out about it.
Right. Right.
So that gets brought up a lot. But at the same time, as I'm hearing these things, I also know that most of the Gardnerian Wiccans that I know are LGBT and are like hardcore activists and really cool people. So there was kind of another one of those little disconnects there.
Mhm.
And once I started getting involved with the coven, I was talking to my teacher about there's like a service aspect of being part of a coven, and I was like, I really want to address this concern that other people have. In North Carolina, we don't have, to my knowledge, like a big fairy community or anything, which is what a lot of people seem to go to when they're disappointed with Wicca. So
Right, right.
I wanted to kind of set the record straight on Wicca,
Right, right.
so that people aren't, going alone, and have some community to sort of be their support system, as they explore witchcraft. And um, I mean, and our coven is just such a great resource because there are so many LGBT people in it, that and people understood that this is an issue and that they wanted to kind of set the record straight as well. Um, so yeah, it just kind of evolved from there. At first, and at first too, it was just a few different interviews. Like I talked to my high priestess about her experience because she went off and joined the Dianics for a while.
Oh, wow.
And well, yeah, she was doing what she calls feminist witchcraft before Dianic witchcraft was around, so she likes to make that point. I'll make it for
Right.
her there. Um,
Right.
and, one of her sons is transgender, and so his coming out process kind of helped her realize that, okay, there's some stuff going on in this community that is not the type of feminist that I am or want to be. And so yeah, she pieced out from the Dianic Wiccans, and that was one of the first interviews we wanted to do because that's an issue that shows up frequently in paganism. And so from there, the interviews just kind of it got around that I was doing them, and everybody's like, "Okay, I want to talk to you too," and
Awesome.
we kind of built from there. Yeah.
So what is it mostly just people's experience, their life experience as Gardnerian witches or North Carolina Gardnerian witches?
Yes, and all of that. We have kind of an interesting bunch, and this is another place where we sort of depart from traditional Gardnerian views. Because we have like some witches who are very not Gardnerian,
Right.
who still come to our rituals and they still like the Gardnerian structure. So I don't really know what that's about, but no, they have their issues with that label, and that's totally legit. We have a really, really good mix there too. I mean, we have obviously my priestess's children who were raised Wiccan, so
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
they have a different experience than other people who have either been initiated and brought in or are just kind of showing up for the fun of it.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, we get a good variety of talking about that. And I mean, we've had some really interesting characters
Mhm.
that I've interviewed who have been initiated in different places and then kind of wound up in the mountains and found our group. So yeah,
That's that sounds a lot like our coven, we our coven is radically inclusive, but we have and it's kind of Alexandrian based, but then
cool.
we've kind of we have that same thing where there's some people that really like more structured stuff, and then
Yeah,
we also do a lot of see the pants kind of stuff and very experimental stuff because
cool.
we just find it more interesting that way.
Yeah, well, and I mean, if you've been in Wicca since like the 70s, you're gonna want to mix up the rituals too, I'm sure.
Right, because if you've been
Uh,
doing the same thing for 20 years, it gets a little
yeah,
boring.
yeah. And that's one of the interesting things too. One of my service tasks is to organize the Book of Shadows for our group, which, oh my god, is
Oh.
an insane task. I don't know why I agreed to that. It's like a big 3-ring notebook with just stuff, like, everywhere. Stuff printed out from, like, early '90s internet pages, like, "Here's some
Wow.
spell I liked," and it's survived 2 fires. So
Wow, that's
yeah.
awesome.
So you've got all these burnt pages too. But it's interesting. I get to be kind of an occult nerd with this, because I can see where somebody got initiated into Thelema and then some Alexandrian influence, and I don't know if this is just like back and forth in the occult community or if somebody like actually pursued these paths or whatever.
Mhm.
But it's just really cool to see all those different layers kind of form in
Mhm.
that. And
That's very cool. That's a very
yeah,
cool piece of history.
right? I know. Yeah. Yeah, that's I had to kinda convince them of that, like, "Okay, you're gonna wanna preserve this, like, this
Right?
is a really important part of, like, North Carolina history," and yeah.
Yeah. Well, do you think that's why you're doing the interviews too, like to preserve that history?
Definitely, and actually, one of our people that I've interviewed has since dropped her body and moved on, so
Wow.
that really just kind of underscored that you've gotta record this history while people are there, and, when you have time to write down people's thoughts or to record people's thoughts, do it,
Mhm.
and, I mean, especially with your coven members who are 70 and older or whatever,
Right?
you wanna get those perspectives down, but, yeah, I think that idea was kind of floating around for a while, and they just kinda needed somebody to come in and do it. So, I'm happy to fill that void.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Are you ever thinking of maybe doing, some actual podcasts or something? Or audio
Maybe.
interviews?
Yeah, and I was thinking I really wanted to preserve the audio stuff. So far, I have not been able to figure out, like, the file size and all that and transferring it from my phone to the computer or to preserve it in some other way. Still kind of researching the technical stuff with that, but I would like to do that in the future, so that it can be more of a multimedia experience other than just reading an interview that I've transcribed.
Mhm.
But
I know being a podcaster myself, it would be really fascinating to me to
yes.
hear some of the voices behind the interviews that you've been doing.
Yeah. And I wanna put some faces out there too. That's kinda the tricky part because a lot
Yeah.
of these people are really in the broom closet, but, that's their choice, and
Mhm.
that's blessed be. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's understandable because, in some areas of the country, it's still kind of hard to be pagan, and even if it's more open than it used to be.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, when you start throwing in other things like socialist, crossdresser,
Right.
bi, poly, like, when you start throwing those things in, it becomes a little bit more complicated, and I can see why they're like, "Okay, I really wanna talk about this stuff because people need to know that this is okay in Wicca, but I don't wanna, like, have my name associated with it because I
Mhm.
can't." So, yeah.
I think we touched on it a little bit earlier,
Mhm.
and I think I want to touch on it again a bit. Is secrecy versus privacy?
Yes.
I know it's a big thing for me, and
Yes.
and there's a huge difference between the two. What do you feel about that? About secrecy versus
I
privacy?
Well, and I love that division of secrecy and privacy. I think those are perfect words to describe it too.
Right.
I'm personally not very big on secrecy. And I to put it in high priestess terms here, we're in the age of Aquarius, and so there's a lot of like free flowing of information. And
Mm.
I think, yeah, but I mean, really though, we're living in an era where it's very easy to access information about totally different world experiences and totally different religious experiences. And I
Mhm.
mean, even in North Carolina, there are multiple witchy traditions, multiple Buddhist traditions. There's all sorts of stuff you can get involved with down here, that'll really blow your mind. But and specifically with Wicca too, like I feel like the secrecy boat has already sailed. Like that
Mhm.
most everything is online. And granted, you don't have like the margin notes of somebody who's been practicing it for 15, 20 years or whatever. And you don't have the like visual instruction of this is how you do certain things, but you can still figure out enough to get a good practice, I feel.
Right.
So I mean, I'm not big on the secrecy stuff. I know that's not a very popular opinion, but whatever, blessed be. And
Yeah, I share that opinion. So high
yeah,
five.
okay, high five, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, and as far as privacy, like, I mean, that's the individual's desire. I have finally gotten to the point where I don't I mean, I'd rather be out so that I can be somebody that people can connect to or whatever, and that's fine with me. So I don't mind being open about what I do and what I practice or believe or whatever. But I understand that other people can't make that commitment or won't for whatever reason, and that's legit too.
Yeah. And also, there's also the privacy of the working the magic itself.
Yes.
Because, working magic, as you well know, is a very intimate experience, and you're very vulnerable with other people.
Yes.
So,
Especially when you're skyclad. Yeah.
right,
We're very
right.
much we're hard guards on that. So
Yeah. I
yeah.
mean, we don't do much of Skycloud unless people, it's like, some midsummer, but, because it's just too darn hot. But,
Yeah.
um, but, being private about what's said in circle and how the magic manifests, I could say we did this cord magic and it was really awesome. And I could say that publicly and, that's great. But I'm not going to sit there and say, oh, and this person asked for this in the cord magic, and this other person asked for this in the cord magic, because that's none of people's business.
Yes, totally. Yeah. And that can easily translate to teaching people and that's part of the thing too, where people are going to be practicing Wicca whether or not other people agree that they're Wiccan or that they're doing it correctly. So we might as well give them some tips on how to do it
Right.
properly since they're going to be doing it anyway.
Right.
Ship has sailed. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I totally agree, because it's like you could do a quick Google search and find everything you need.
For real. Yeah.
It's, yeah. I mean, I had an ex-coven leader, and I've talked about this in previous episodes, and he was like that, he was very much about keeping the coven secrets, and, and we couldn't play with others because we had to keep things secret, and, and, that way lies culty.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
And the other downside of secrecy, at least in my opinion, is that it can hide a lot of that kind of culty or abusive
Yes.
stuff.
Yes.
And in my case, it did hide a cultish abusive stuff.
Yeah.
And that's where the downside of secrecy, and that's a lot of the reasons why I advocate not to have secrecy.
Yeah. I empathize with that totally. Yes. That's an excellent point. Yeah.
So we're just about at the end of our time.
All
right. I'm sure we can talk to each other a lot more, but
yes.
yeah.
We'll have to do this again.
Absolutely. Well, maybe we can do one to celebrate the repeal of HB2.
Yes. Deal. Okay.
All right.
I'm in for that.
High five.
Yeah.
Terrorist fist bump. All right.
Yes.
But so if people would like, I mean, we're gonna have this in the show notes too, but if people would like to get in touch with you to talk about any of these issues, or if they're from North Carolina and want to learn more about your group, what would be the best way to get in touch with you?
Well, there are two possible ways. You can either go to the patmosley.wordpress.com website, and there's a contact me link on there that'll send an email directly to my phone, so I will get it. It may just take me a while to respond, but I will get it. And then there's also the Mountain CUUPs website, which is mtncuups.wordpress.com. I can't recall if we have a contact link, but we post when and where all of our meetings are. And seriously, anybody, North Carolina, even Virginia or Tennessee, we have other people that come from that way. So come on out for our events. And especially to the heathen folks that are in these parts, I would say come to our events because we can connect you with other heathens. We get lots of requests like, where are the hearths? And we're like, we'll show up and we'll connect you. So
excellent.
Yeah.
Well, I know there's a few heathens in my audience, so that will be very useful.
Yes. Well, awesome. Thank you very much for doing this interview and having me on here.
Well, thank you so much for being on. It's been really, really interesting, and hopefully we'll have to have that celebratory podcast.
Yes. Well.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on.
Yep. Thank you. Bye.
I'd like to thank Pat for joining us on This Week in Heresy. You can subscribe to This Week in Heresy via TuneIn, iTunes, Stitcher, or the app of your choice. You can also financially support this podcast through patreon.com. Thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions or comments, Feel free to leave me a message through Twitter at TWIH Podcast or on thisweekinheresy.com.